My name is Ken Ferraro, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this symposium. I am director of the Center on Aging and the Life course here at Purdue, and today's symposium is Health Across Generations. Welcome. If you arrived in time to browse the poster session, you have a better sense of some of the research going on at Purdue that relates to intergenerational health issues. And I want to thank each of the presenters. You may not have noticed, but there were actually 7 different departments represented in those posters, 3 colleges at Purdue University. If you didn't make it through all the posters will be up during the break, so you'll have a chance to catch those that you might have missed earlier. I'd like to introduce our program committee for this symposium. They've actually been working since, I think it was last November. Would the program committee please stand as I call your names? Michelle Foreman, Jennifer Freeman, Christy Sennett, Amanda Viley, and Tracy Robinson. Is Tracy in here? Well, you've got 4 of the many. Thank you so much. They've put together a package that I think will be a meaningful day for you. There are also 3 organizational sponsors that I'd like to acknowledge. First of all, the Department of Nutrition Science. Secondly, the Department of Anthropology. And third, the Purdue University Retirees Association. The support from the Purdue University Retirees Association also enables us to video record the proceedings, which is a great asset on the educational side, so we can make this symposium available for years to come. Thank you. For those who pre-registered, you should have a booklet with an agenda and some further reading references. And I hope that you've got yourself situated and know the surroundings of PMU. When I think of intergenerational health, I like to think about 3 different vantage points for the study of aging. One vantage point is to track prospectively the aging process. Some studies pick up subjects at 50 or 40 years of age and watch them as they grow older, and then they make generalizations about what they see. Some of the most exciting longitudinal studies are those that capture people very early in life and track them. Perhaps the British National Health and Human Development Survey is the most exceptional of all those studies, tracking people from 1946, born in 1946, and they're still tracking them today. That's the prospective view of aging, or the study of aging. Another approach is to take species and look for the most long-lived creatures or organisms in that species, and to try to think about, well, how did they reach such exceptional ages, what I call the exceptional longevity approach, where we look at older people or older orange roughy or older bats or older opossums, and we wonder, how did they get so old? It's kind of a rear view mirror approach, right? Find older organisms and then ask the question, how did they do this? They're an elite. How did they do it? A third approach is the approach we're going to focus on today, what I call the family lineage approach. In this approach, we focus on ancestry, bloodlines, family connections, because we know that family carries some genetic substrate. That's part of the equation, but it also carries a host of cultural and social factors that influence health. And what we're trying to do today is draw attention to how generations influence one another. Yes, the flow does go both ways. These 3 vantage points are essential for gerontology, but they're not mutually exclusive. So this vantage point today, the intergenerational component, really can be coupled with either of the other perspectives. The 3 vantage points help us to see what we mean by health across generations. To introduce our first speaker, I want to call my colleague and program committee member, Amanda Viley, who will introduce our first speaker. Amanda is Assistant Professor of Anthropology and a Faculty Associate of the Center on Aging and the Life course. Amanda?
morning. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Jonathan Wells, who has come here from the UK to participate in our symposium. Dr. Wells is known for his research in global health and nutrition, as well as population health and life course approaches to health. He's also made major contributions to current debates in evolutionary theory. Dr. Wells completed a bachelor's degree in social anthropology, which we call cultural anthropology here, at the University of Cambridge. He completed a master's degree in biological anthropology, also at the University of Cambridge, and a PhD in biological anthropology and nutrition, also at the University of Cambridge. He did postdoctoral research at the Medical Research Council Dunn Nutrition Center in Cambridge, and then moved to the University of College London, where he is now a professor of anthropology and pediatric nutrition. Dr. Wells focuses on pediatric body composition and energy metabolism. His methodological work has refined and pioneered a number of techniques to measure energy expenditure, body composition, and breast milk intake in children of very young ages. He's involved in a number of international projects in the UK, Europe, South America, Africa, and Asia, where he applies these nutritional research methods to understand the links between early life nutrition and later health. He also is interested in aiding the interpretation of these data and their application to public health policy. So he works extensively in this area as well as in evolutionary theory, addressing specifically the association between developmental plasticity and health. And I believe this is what we're going to hear about today. As an anthropologist, I cannot emphasize enough the magnitude of his research contributions to this area of evolutionary theory and human health. I discovered his work when I was in graduate school, and it seemed like every time I got interested in something, he had written extensively on it. And I thought, who is this amazing, prolific scholar? So I'm very happy that he's here. And I just want to add that his recent work on nutritional contributions to pregnancy complications around the world has really informed and inspired my own work. So I welcome you to invite Dr. Wells. Very, very happy that you've come. And thank you all for being here.
Right, well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here. I really appreciate the invitation, and I very much enjoyed meeting members of the faculty yesterday. So I'm going to talk on maternal capital and the metabolic ghetto, an evolutionary perspective on how society shapes the intergenerational transmission of health. The disease outcomes I'm most interested in are chronic non-communicable diseases, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, stroke, and obesity. But the arguments are relevant to many other conditions as well. The reason why I'm interested in these diseases is that they are now the main source of morbidity and premature mortality worldwide, really in every global region. This is not something restricted to high-income countries. Now, these diseases have their onset typically in middle or old age, and we know that our lifestyle is very important. We know that our diet matters, our body weight, and behaviors such as smoking. We also know they cluster within families, and in the past we might have said that means genes, but now we know that clustering in families is more complex than that. Now, diseases of wear and tear are nothing new. We can look back into populations such as here in ancient Rome and see that the probability of dying starts to accelerate from around the age of 45. That suggests, although we don't have tremendous detail, that the body is starting to fall apart at an accelerating rate. So chronic diseases aren't new, but their dominant influence on the human lifespan is new. So the main public health response to chronic diseases until recently has just been to tell us to behave better. We're responsible. And I very much like this picture which says, beware of luxury. All the things we like are actually not very good for us. But then in the 1990s or late 1980s, we had a major new theoretical contribution to understanding chronic diseases, led in particular by David Barker with papers such as this one here, telling us that weight in infancy could actually help predict the likelihood of death from ischemic heart disease in old age. We now understand that there's a life course process during which our metabolic characteristics emerge. We know that there are critical windows early in life when we're plastic and responsive to environmental stimuli, and variability that emerges during those windows can then track on into later life because the critical windows closed and we become less sensitive. So that means we need quite a complex life course perspective. We can be interested in plasticity at different periods. We have the developmental plasticity, but then we have the plasticity in adulthood, which is when we try and get people to change their behavior and actually affect their chronic disease risk. So you can see that they interact in shaping whether your disease risk is high or low. Now, if you're an anthropologist and you get interested in plasticity, you tend to think that it must have its roots in some kind of process of adaptation. Surely if you respond to the environment, that's how evolution has shaped us to improve our fitness. And yet if all of this plasticity is helping understand the pathway to chronic disease, that looks more like maladaptation. So here's a conundrum that we need to solve. Now, in the modern era, we're thankfully living longer on average than in ancient Rome, so that you can say that we're delaying the rate of aging. So that seems like a positive effect. But then we have something more concerning, which is that there is profound variability in the rate of aging. Here you have data from England, 2009 to 2011, comparing the lifespan of the poorest versus the wealthiest tenth of the population. The poorest men live on average 9 years less long than the wealthiest, and for the women, the difference is 7 years. And the duration of the healthy lifespan, the period before which you get a chronic disease, is roughly 20 years different in each sex. So we have major variability in aging and chronic disease risks, and we really need to understand that if we want to make progress. So what I want to present in this discussion is a multidisciplinary approach. It's quite heavy on concept because I think what we need is conceptual frameworks that allow us to process very different types of data. People collect all sorts of different data with different machines, different theoretical paradigms, and so on. My argument is that we need to understand human physiology, also evolutionary biology, and also the role of society. And in particular, we need to bring those things together, because if we use them together, then they contribute more than just the sum of their parts. And really, everything I'm saying in this talk has been discussed in some length in a book I published last year called The Metabolic Ghetto. What I wanted to address is the way that chronic diseases ultimately have their basis in the interactions of society. But if you want to make those kinds of statements, you need to address these three issues that I've just mentioned. So this talk will go through the multidisciplinary approach, starting with some physiology. So David Barker gave pioneering new data showing that the risk of chronic diseases in old age was elevated in those who had low birth weight. And this was one of the US studies that replicated that, showing, as you can see here, that the risk of heart disease in old age was elevated if you were born below 2,500 grams. And that wasn't just for heart disease. You could see the same pattern for many different chronic disease outcomes. This is the odds ratio of glucose intolerance, a major risk factor for diabetes, once again, the highest risk in those born low birth weight. Subsequently, many cohort studies replicated these findings. If you looked at overt disease, low birth weight babies were more likely to be dead by a certain age. You could also see that the low birth weight was associated with elevated risk markers, such as insulin resistance, blood lipids, arterial disease, and high blood pressure. This was one of the most interesting studies that David Barker produced. He looked backwards, just as Professor Ferrario was saying, stratifying people according to whether they had or had not died of a heart attack. And he showed, if you look at the blue line, that's setting everyone who hadn't died of a heart attack to 0, and the others who had died of a heart attack, he showed their growth data here. And you can see that they tended to be below average during the first couple of years of life, but then they tended to have some kind of catch-up growth later on. To interpret his data, Nick Hales and David Barker produced what they call the thrifty phenotype hypothesis, which has been a tremendous stimulus to my own thinking. I really always go back to this amazing paper. What they suggested was that when infants or fetuses are confronted with an adequate supply of energy, they respond by reducing the growth of some organs, in particular the pancreas and the liver. And that's to protect the brain. And they called that a survival phenotype. It would be a solution in the short term to not having enough energy. The problem was that in the long term, those smaller organs would go on to provide lower tolerance of nutritional excess in later life. And by excess, I mean traits such as obesity, physical inactivity, and consuming a rich diet. Now, the thrifty phenotype didn't just apply to diabetes. You could look at any chronic disease in that way. And here was some early supporting data which matched very well. These are data from Sweden looking at their blood pressure. Along the front, you can see groups of men of normal BMI and stratified by birth weight. And at the back, you can see men who were both tall and obese. The front of the graph, for men with normal BMI, there wasn't much association between birth weight and adult blood pressure. But at the back of the graph, for those who are both tall and obese, the lower their birth weight, the higher their blood pressure. But what was really interesting about these data that were coming out of all these cohorts was that this was not an association restricted to those born small. Actually, what we are seeing is an inverse dose-response association between birth weight and the risk of chronic disease. And again, that's not just true for heart disease. You can see the same thing across a wide range of disease outcomes. So actually, most of the association between size at birth and the risk of chronic disease in later life lies within the normal range of birth weight. We can't be talking about some process of fetal malnutrition. Every additional unit of birth weight actually reduces the disease risk in later life, at least at the group level. So really, the chronic disease risk is just tracking levels of growth achieved in early life. So let's have a little more think about what we know about the biology of growth. Well, we can divide growth into two fundamental periods, which are termed hyperplasia and hypertrophy. Hyperplasia refers to an increase in cell number, and hypertrophy refers to an increase in cell size. Now, this was something that was picked up by Hales and Barker. They argued that the hyperplasic period of growth was very important because that's when the structure of organs develops. Building on their work, I've defined two terms which I call metabolic capacity and metabolic load, which I'm just going to explain. And the important issue is that they broadly develop during these two contrasting periods of growth. So by metabolic capacity, I'm referring to characteristics of organ structure and function, and these matter right through the life course in terms of the ability of the body to maintain homeostasis. And obviously, if you're maintaining homeostasis, then you're holding at bay the risk factors for chronic disease. So they last right through the life course, but they are strongly contingent on early growth, the period of hyperplasia. And if you look closely, you can see that a number of traits scale relatively linearly with birth weight and early life. These are data from an Ethiopian birth cohort I'm involved with, and you can see that the larger the birth weight, the larger the lean mass at birth. And the lean mass, of course, contains all the organs and the tissues. These are data from the Alsbach cohort in the UK. Here we have ponderal index, so weight adjusted for length at birth, and the capacity to secrete insulin at 8 years, which of course is very important for regulating blood sugar. Heavier birth, better blood sugar control capacity. And these are data on weight at birth and the number of nephrons in the kidney. And again, a broad dose-response association until the highest birth weights. Nephrons are very important through the life course for blood pressure regulation, and you can't grow extra nephrons after birth. So your size at birth is going to track on with its implications through the life course. Now, we could make more sophisticated models of metabolic capacity, and I hope people do. We could go beyond organ and tissue physiology. We could look at gene expression. We can look at epigenetics within the same conceptual framework. We could look at hormonal set points. And we can go beyond the human and look at the gut biota as well. So it's a work in progress, but I hope the concept is useful. Now, what challenges your metabolic capacity, what challenges homeostasis, can be thought of in different ways. And we already had the concept of allostatic load, which was focused on the stress response, and paying particular attention to the HPA axis and the hormone cortisol. But I'd like to draw more attention to just basic energy metabolism, fuel homeostasis, and I've used the term metabolic load. So we're interested in particular in the hormone insulin, but by no means only insulin. There are many other hormones and aspects of physiology that are also important. So we could look at metabolic load in a bit more detail. We could talk about fattening diets. We could talk about smoking because it perturbs blood lipid levels as well as affecting the lungs. There are many issues around obesity we could focus on. We could focus on sedentary behavior, not clearing your fuel when you've ingested it. We could look at infectious diseases because the survival response of the body to an infection is actually to have many different subtle effects on our metabolism. And we could also look at psychosocial stress to some extent in the same way because the hormone cortisol certainly has effects on metabolism. So metabolic load, if you increase it, results in signaling perturbations in the cells, fuel homeostasis perturbations, and hemodynamic perturbations. And all of these impact and challenge the body's ability to maintain homeostasis. We can, again, be a bit more exploratory about how we investigate metabolic load. There are unanswered questions for diet. There's this endless debate, is it eating too much fat or is it eating too much sugar? When we talk about physical activity, is it that we should be active or we should avoid being sedentary? And what about how much sleep we should get? And for obesity, is it just the body weight, or is it the amount and deposition of the fat, or is it actually something inside the cellular metabolism? So again, this is a work in progress, and we can continue to explore what matters in terms of metabolic load. And then we can make a very simple conceptual model of disease risk. So at the front here, we have groups categorized by the level of metabolic capacity. For simplicity, we could just measure birth weight, or we could try and measure something in more detail, such as nephron number. Up the right-hand side, we have some index of metabolic load. Again, it could just be adult obesity status by BMI or childhood weight gain, or we could try and measure something in more detail. And up the left-hand side, we have the risk of these chronic diseases, diabetes, heart disease, and so on. And the idea of the model is that whatever metabolic load you have in adult life, the less capacity you developed in early life, the higher your chronic disease risk. And equally, whatever metabolic capacity you developed in early life, if you increase the metabolic load subsequently, again, you increase your chronic disease risk. And so you can predict that your greatest chronic disease risk would occur in those who were born with a low capacity and went on to build on top of it a high metabolic load. So that's a very simple conceptual model. What do we see if we actually look at data? Well, there were a couple of publications a couple of years ago which were extraordinary in how well they seemed to fit this model. So these came from 3 US cohorts, and what you can see here is birth weight groups along the front and a number of unhealthy lifestyle factors up the right-hand side. So traits such as high BMI, physical inactivity, smoking, and so on. Now, along the front of the graph, you can see that if you were a relatively healthy adult, then there was a pretty weak association between birth weight and the risk of adult diabetes. But at the back of the graph, if you're an unhealthy adult, then you can see that the lower your birth weight, the higher your diabetes risk. Even clearer results for hypertension. Once again, healthy adults, there's a weak association between birth weight and hypertension, but at the back of the graph, if you're an unhealthy adult, you really pay a penalty for the poor development of metabolic capacity in early life. Well, we can go beyond just looking in adulthood, and we can look across the life course and try and see how metabolic load develops. This was another classic study by Erickson and colleagues looking at childhood BMI rather than adult BMI in association with the risk of mortality from coronary heart disease and old age. And again, you just see the same pattern. Essentially, you're measuring the metabolic load much earlier in the life course, but the effects go on into old age. This is another paper. It's hot off the press, so it still tells you that. This is the association between age at menarche and a hazard ratio of diabetes in a Chinese cohort. Early at menarche predicts risk of diabetes as well. Then we can look at adult body size. These are data from a number of different studies looking at the protective effect of being tall, and you can see that in most populations there's a reduced risk of diabetes if you're a tall adult. There are a couple of exceptions, and we do understand why there are exceptions, but I won't have time to explain that in detail now. And then, of course, the most obvious trait, the exponential association between adult BMI and risk of the metabolic syndrome. So I was asked to produce a couple of sort of points in the talk when I pause and say, well, what have we got so far? So the take-home message, number one, is that we can predict chronic disease risk with some accuracy from knowing someone's adult lifestyle and the state of their body, and also their developmental trajectory. And that's very important. And it's a kind of personalized medicine that's very different from genetics. But why these traits? Why do we see a kind of life course signature emerging from a whole pattern of things which are somewhat related? Size at birth, the rate of childhood weight gain, age at puberty, adult height, and adult BMI. These all help explain chronic disease risk. Why this life course pattern? So to understand that, we need to shift away from physiology and look to evolutionary biology to understand why these traits have relationships. Now, when people first looked at human evolution, they were most interested in the traits that all humans share together. We wanted to know why we'd ended up with big brains, why we walked upright, and why we have extremely interesting hands that are very capable of doing lots of different tasks. And these traits were generally thought, although there were a lot of different underlying approaches, to be some kind of solution to long-term ecological stresses. And people got interested in changes in the environment, perhaps the spread of the savanna ecosystem across Africa. Maybe humans also contributed some of their own selective pressures. If humans became more social, maybe that favored a larger brain. And certainly, if we look back in the climate record, we can see some good supporting evidence for some of these theories. These are data over the last 5 million years on global temperature, and you can see that steadily it's become cooler. And in association with that global cooling, that did provoke the spread of the savanna ecosystem across Africa, which is where we think the most important periods of human evolution occurred. And that's given rise to what's now called the savanna hypothesis, that it was this environment that shaped the fundamental traits that humans evolved. And the underlying mechanism was widely assumed to be genetic adaptation, that there would always be some degree of genetic variability, ecological stresses would act as the selective pressure, and ultimately evolution would keep producing a fitter genotype, and we would see those human traits emerge. What we've seen in the last 100,000 years or so is that humans have left Africa and colonized really every major global region. So they've encountered many different habitats, many of them extremely different to the savanna environment in which human evolution began. And yet, we haven't really shown a large degree of genetic adaptation to all those different environments. I'm not a geneticist, but I'm told that the size of the trees on these plots indicates the magnitude of genetic diversity. And all you need to see here is that the size of the trees for chimpanzees is greater than the entire human species. So when we've got to all these different niches, we clearly haven't done it by systematic and marked genetic adaptation. It's not to say there's no genetic adaptation, but it's remarkable how common our genetic profile is, given the number of different habitats that we've occupied. So there's something else that's very important in the climate record, and that was picked up by Rick Potts in particular. And what he emphasized was that alongside this trend to global cooling, there was also an increasing degree of oscillation over shorter time periods in global temperature. That translates directly into ecosystem change. And the larger these oscillations get, the more the ecosystem is changing, the more likely it is to produce rates of change that matter either across individual life courses or across generations. Now, how can animals respond to volatile, unpredictable environments? It's less a case of evolving the right solutions by genetic adaptation and more developing biological systems of risk management. So there would have been selection for greater plasticity. And that would allow you not to respond necessarily to stresses, but actually to buffer them through various different components of biological flexibility. Now, we can think of adaptation in terms of life history strategy. Again, a classic contribution from Steve Stearns and colleagues. Each organism makes a series of decisions how fast to live, when to stop growing, when to start reproducing, and how many offspring to produce and how much to invest in each. And when life history theory was first developed, it was widely used to explain differences across species, which we could assume to be largely genetic. So that we could see an animal like a mouse living typically for less than a year, an animal like an elephant living for 60 years, and other organisms lying in between. And this gave rise to a very broad concept of fast or slower life histories, although nowadays that concept is getting a bit more complicated. How would animals achieve these different life histories? Life history theory suggested it was through differential investment of energy in different functions. And the four functions that were held to be most important were maintenance, which of course is homeostasis, maintaining the body in good condition, growth, reproduction, and defense against pathogens and predators. And of course, the more energy you invest in any one of those functions, the less you have to invest in others. And again, the theory paid a lot of attention initially to extrinsic mortality risk in shaping the optimum allocation of those energy investments. If there's a high risk of dying, then it doesn't make sense to maintain the body in good condition because you'll never survive to reap the benefits. So it's better to stop growing early and start reproducing. But that means that if extrinsic mortality risk falls, then evolution would favor a higher investment in maintenance. So on the right-hand side of the graph, if you're investing more in maintenance and you're not caught by a predator or succumbing to a pathogen, your lifespan should extend. So we can see a very nice association here between extrinsic mortality risk and the intrinsic lifespan of individual organisms. But we don't just need to apply this theory across species. We can also use it to understand variability within a species and the variability that emerges within each individual's life course. We also invest differently in maintenance and growth and reproduction and immune function. So we can see a slow-fast continuum within life courses, within humans, and suddenly that helps us make more sense of these particular traits. Birth weight, childhood growth, age at puberty, adult size, and BMI, these all represent trade-offs to ecological cues achieved through life history energy allocations, and they shape the rate of aging in the long term. So we can think of the body as passing through a series of reaction norms, and we accumulate the different reaction norms and their effects, and ultimately that shapes the rate of aging. But what impacts the pace of life history on an individual basis? So again, most attention was initially directed to extrinsic mortality risk, and others have been interested in psychosocial stress. But what about experience in utero? How might that affect the pace of life history? Well, one evolutionary theory of plasticity as adaptation in early life was the predictive adaptive response hypothesis of Gluckman and Hansen. They suggested that organisms during the early critical windows are seeking cues of the environmental conditions that they're occupying. They make a prediction from those cues that they will experience the same conditions by the time they reach adulthood, and they therefore tailor their phenotype in anticipation of reaching those particular conditions. If the environment is indeed the same when they reach adulthood, then they are matched, and that means that they should have good prospects for fitness and also good metabolic health. But if the environment changes between the time when they undergo the critical window and their experience of the adult environment, then they could be mismatched, and that would predict poor metabolic health and also poorer fitness. So here the offspring is trying to predict the future environment from its experience in early life. Now, I've been very critical of this theory for a number of reasons. There's a certain implausibility about it from the point of view of organisms that have a brief critical window but then live for many decades afterwards. But there's something else that's also very important, because if we look at maternal physiology, we can see that the mother has many traits that buffer the fetus from external environmental influences. What the fetus is actually exposed to is maternal phenotype. There are some stable traits, such as maternal height and body size, adiposity, energy stores, and also the volume of the uterus. But then also the baby is exposed to the mother's capacity for homeostasis, showing up as her blood pressure, her glycemic control, and her lipid levels. So this is what the offspring is actually exposed to. Building on the embodied capital model of Kaplan and colleagues, I've suggested that we need to think about maternal capital as the niche in which the offspring is located during its earliest critical windows of development. We could think beyond the body itself, which could be thought of as somatic capital, and also take into account various parameters of social or cognitive capital, and we can also look at material resources. And obviously, maternal capital ends up being divided in many cases between competing offspring, so that each offspring might get its share. It might not be a fair share of maternal capital. So you could also say that during the earliest periods of development, offspring aren't really physically mature enough to respond adaptively to all these different things going on in the environment. There are many different ecological signals. How could a fetus actually track all of them? Well, it doesn't have to. What it has to track is maternal phenotype. She's providing a relatively stable ecological niche in terms of the fetus by buffering all these external effects. So if the offspring is making some kind of adaptive response in early life, it's not to the environment, it's to the mother's phenotype. And we can see across many data sets strong imprints of maternal capital on the phenotype of the offspring. These are data from a range of low and middle income countries, and on the x-axis we have maternal height. And on the y-axis, we have the likelihood that the child is either stunted or underweight or actually dies before 5 years of age. Now, of course, stunting and overweight indicate a depletion of the offspring's metabolic capacity with lifelong consequences. So here you can see that taller mothers confer on their offspring more metabolic capacity. Not all the somatic traits of the mother are beneficial for the offspring. We can also think of traits that are going to perturb the mother's homeostasis, diabetes, hypertension, or infection. That would result in poorer maternal homeostasis, and that would reduce the quality of investment in the next generation. But we can also use the same approach to think about maternal social capital. These are data across countries, 96 countries, and on the x-axis here we have the Gender Inequality Index. So this is a societal index of how equal women are treated relative to men. And you can see that in each case, in societies with worse gender equality, there's an increased prevalence of low birth weight, stunting, wasting, and child mortality. If we don't treat women well in a societal level, then we pass on penalties to the next generation in terms of their growth, their metabolic capacity, and their long-term disease risk. So if we go back to our idea that each life history strategy or trajectory is a series of decisions that ultimately shape the onset of aging, each decision is made in the context of others that were made earlier. And when we follow the chain back, the earliest decisions are all made in the context or under the imprint of maternal capital. This tells us why maternal phenotype is so important in shaping the chronic disease risk of the next generation. Now, if the mother is unable to invest as much in the offspring in critical windows, that is a long-term depletion of the capacity for homeostasis, less maintenance. So we could predict a faster rate of aging and a shorter lifespan. And the problem is that offspring actually encounters more energy later in the life course? Well, it's too late to get the best payoff of investing it in maintenance because the critical windows have closed. What you could do to increase fitness if you get the energy later is invest either just in survival or in reproduction. So we can make some predictions. This is a schematic diagram with on the left the level of maternal investment, and I'm suggesting that orchestrates the pace of life history adopted by the offspring. And that would see different allocations across the life history functions. So what I've shown here is that if the mother is unable to invest substantially in the offspring, to maximize its fitness, would have been selected to have a faster pace of life history. That would suggest less investment in growth, shorter adult height, more investment in storing energy for reproduction if she's a woman, so higher adiposity, and poorer metabolic health. And here are some supporting data from a UK cohort, and this is quite a small study of South Asian women in the UK, but we now have data from much larger cohorts broadly showing the same thing. What you can see here is that larger birth weight, i.e. the index of maternal investment, is correlated with later age at menarche, so the daughters are going through their life more slowly. If they have a later age at menarche, they are taller in adulthood, so they've invested more in growth by having longer to grow in. Conversely, if they have an earlier age at menarche, they have higher levels of body fatness, so they've shifted away from investing in linear growth towards storing energy for reproduction. And finally, if they are fatter, and if you follow the logic here, the fatter individuals are also the shorter individuals, they have higher systolic blood pressure. Now, none of these are above the cutoff for hypertension, but you can already see variability in blood pressure being explained by the life course trajectory and ultimately going back to the maternal investment. So the second take-home message from this talk is that humans have evolved like other mammals, maternal buffering during the critical periods of development. The periods when the offspring is most sensitive to ecological stresses, those stresses are buffered by the mother. But what that means is that we then pick up a lifelong imprint of maternal capital. So the question is, how much maternal capital were we exposed to? And that is what has a profound effect on the life history trajectory of the offspring and the rate of aging. Okay, if we know that, we've got some very interesting questions to look further at. Why should chronic disease risk vary so strongly across social groups and also across ethnic groups? So to answer those questions, we need to move on to thinking about society. Now, as soon as we look at social traits in association with the capacity load model, we see some very interesting things. These are data from Brazil, one of the birth cohorts there, and we have family income in minimum wages on the x-axis, and on the left-hand y-axis birth rate, and on the right-hand axis infant weight gain up to 12 months of age. It's very clear that in this population, the wealthier families produce larger babies at birth, and they go on to continue growing better in the first year of life. This is the window when metabolic capacity develops, so wealthier families are clearly allowing their offspring to accumulate much better metabolic capacity. If we look later in the life course, and this is now data from the UK, you can see that the least deprived individuals are showing the lowest prevalence of childhood obesity. And what's fascinating here is that there is an inverse dose-response association between the level of deprivation and the prevalence of childhood obesity. So now those from the poorest backgrounds have both of the risk factors for chronic disease. They're on a fast track towards chronic diseases because they began life with less metabolic capacity, but even by early childhood, they've accumulated more metabolic load. So this helps us understand why social status is very important in early life in predicting long-term chronic disease risk. We can look in the same way across ethnic groups. Again, these are data from the UK. On the right, we've got the European majority population, and then a series of ethnic minority groups. The bars below the central line are the deficit in percentage terms in birth weight compared to the Europeans, and the bars pointing upwards are the prevalence of a low birth weight. And you can see that all of the ethnic groups, the minority groups, have a birth weight on average that is 5 to 10% lower, and that means they also have a higher risk of low birth weight. So we don't see an equal distribution of metabolic capacity in early life. You could look at metabolic loads in many different ways. I just want to pick out one example. In the UK, much attention is given to the fact that in adulthood and in childhood as well, there's a different ratio of fat mass to lean mass between different ethnic groups, in particular South Asians versus Europeans. For a given level of lean mass, and hence for the same BMI value, South Asian populations have a higher level of fatness, and that is associated with an elevated risk of diabetes and heart disease in that population. Now again, in the old days, if we looked at these ethnic differences, it might be tempting to assume that this reflects genotype. But what I'll show you a little later in the talk is that many of these differences, they may be transmissible across generations, but it doesn't need to involve genotype. So let's step back a bit. Why do individual humans experience nutrition and grow and have nutritional status so differently? And I think that needs to be connected with another question, which I think is just the reverse way of looking at the same issue. Why are human societies typically hierarchical in the first place? It's almost a characteristic of the human species. We pay a lot of attention to social inequality now. The egalitarian societies are the exceptions rather than the rule. Once again, we can get a lot of insight, I would suggest, if we step back from humans and use broader ecological models because they detach themselves from some of the emotions that we bring when we discuss this in humans. So I want to focus here on a game produced by Barnard and Sibley in the 80s, which was used for birds, but I think has a lot to say about understanding human behavior. And it's called the producer-scrounger game. Now, what Barnard and Sibley were telling us is that individual birds can use two strategies to go and get their food. They can either go and find food directly, which is called producing, or they can wait till another bird has found the food, and they can just try and steal it, and that's called scrounging. Now, initially, when they were looking at this, they were really looking across species. One type of bird would find the food, and another type of bird would try and steal it. But then they realized this was also going on within the same species. There were producing birds, and there were scrounging birds, and you can see exactly that going on here for seagulls. Now, the idea of the producer-scrounger model is that you can think of it as a dynamic game, because whether or not you should produce or scrounge depends what other people in the population are doing. If everybody is producing, it makes sense to scrounge because there's a lot out there to scrounge. But if everyone tried scrounging and no one was producing, there wouldn't be anything to scrounge. So some individuals would be better off than going to produce. So here's a good example of a producer. He's a puffin, and he nests on islands around the UK, and he's got a very nice beakful there of sand eels. And he's taking them back to his nest to feed his offspring. The problem is that when he gets back to the island, this is what's waiting for him. The gulls just sit around on the island waiting for the puffins to come back. And when they arrive, the gulls go straight for the sand eels. At this time of year, they're not trying to eat the puffin because they've outsourced foraging to the puffin. They just want the payload that the puffin has brought back. The poor old puffin has to nest in burrows, but they're quite clumsy. And when they try and land, they scuttle into their burrow, and this is what happens if they don't make it fast enough. So if we step back again, we can think that there are life history consequences in the producer-scrounger game, depending on who ends up with more of the energy. Now, the producer could potentially get what's called the finder's share. If the producer finds the food and consumes it on the spot, there's nothing to scrounge. The problem for that noble puffin was that he was taking the food back to his offspring. So he couldn't consume it. He had to leave it, and it was very visible. You can see these sand eels pointing out of their beaks as they're flying in. So if the scrounger gets the energy, then the scrounger will actually have a life history payoff that the producer has just lost. So I think we can use this producer-scrounger model to look at social inequality in humans because it immediately draws attention to the fundamental link between social inequality and nutrition and the diseases associated with nutrition. What we do know that some populations of humans are actually quite egalitarian. Foragers who don't practice agriculture tend to be highly mutualistic because that's a very successful strategy in an environment which has a lot of unpredictability. What we do know also, though, is looking at the historical record, is occasionally when foragers encountered very rich niches, then we could see some inequality emerging. So you don't have to have agriculture to have a little more hierarchy in human societies. But on the whole, foragers actively suppress hierarchy and maintain a high level of egalitarian behavior. But once you have scrounging, then we're doing what the puffin was doing. We're storing very visible hoards of food, either as stock animals or as harvests, grain stores, and so on. And once they're there, then scrounging becomes a viable activity, and some individuals may decide to pursue that. If we look back into the ancient world, then synonymous with the origins of agriculture were the origins of defensive settlements, building up defenses against scrounging. And if you look back at the ancient history, then one of the most ubiquitous characteristics is siege warfare. Some people build a settlement that tries to defend their food stores against potential attackers, and on the outside, the attackers actually use nutrition to try and win. They try and starve the inhabitants of the defensive settlement into submission. And civilians are not there accidentally. This is a map of the siege of Alesia in 51 BC by Julius Caesar of Vercingetorix, who was the last independent chieftain of ancient Gaul. Now, Caesar built two palisades, one that faced in, pointing at the fort, and one facing out to keep the relief force at bay. Inside the fort, Vercingetorix could see that his food supplies were running low, so he evicted the women and children, pushed them outside, hoping that Caesar would let them go and he would last for longer and maybe relief would arrive. Caesar was uninterested. He just left the women and children to starve in front of the lines. No relief force came, and Vercingetorix had to surrender. The Mongols used an even more subtle strategy. They used to sack a series of small settlements, forcing the inhabitants to flee towards the larger cities, and there they would run down the food supplies faster, and that would result in the defensive settlement having to surrender. Now, castles aren't really relevant to modern life, but unfortunately, starvation as a modern weapon of war remains highly relevant, and you can see that in the news today in countries like Syria and the Yemen. But we don't need to focus on armed conflict to use the producer-scrounger model to understand nutrition and the construction of human societies. Just in any society generally, we can use the producer-scrounger model. In its earlier stages, the producers produced the food and a lot of other resources, and by different means, they were scrounged by others. And here's a very nice frieze from the British Museum. This is the standard of Ur from ancient Mesopotamia. And you can see the producer-scrounger game illustrated very clearly. In the top panel is the elite enjoying a very nice feast with some wine goblets and some music on the right. And underneath are all the people producing the food for that feast. And some of them, you can see that they are actually under some kind of or other condition of constraint. So over millennia, humans have routinely found many ways to coerce cheap labor and actually gain food resources from them. There are different ways of doing this. It can be applying ideological definitions of class or caste you have to produce because you're that kind of person. It could be economic, forcing people into debt or demanding that they pay taxes so that they have to sell food to pay the tax. Or it can be overt physical violence. And we still see slavery in the news today. In the UK, we're still having on a daily basis news of people forced through violence to work. The modern industrial workforce was partly created by removing access for the ability to produce food, obliging people to work for wages in order to just consume food themselves. If producers don't get as much food, it's going to show up in their life history traits. And so we can look back and see data such as these from England and Italy that the working classes had lower height throughout development persisting into adult life comparing to those who were higher up in the social hierarchy. But in modern industrial society, the producer-scrounger game could be said to have been reinvented. Now, what the scrounger wants is not the food, because they've got enough food. What they want is the wealth that comes from the food economy. So the producer has been reinvented as a consumer. The producers are now both producing food or producing work in other ways and also consuming the food. And it's the wealth, the profit, that goes to the scroungers. And so there are also many ways that consumption of food and other products is coerced. There are many ways that when we consume our food, we are subject to elements that are beyond conscious control. We know that the macronutrient content of foods affects our appetite. And then there are additives such as caffeine that can also stimulate our appetite and behavior. There are many things that act on our psychology, the way that products are placed in shops, priced, packaged, portion sizes, the way that people behave with us in restaurants. And of course, thinking beyond food, but also products that are relevant to our metabolism, you can't forget nicotine in cigarettes. And then there are the social norms, things that we aspire to, and we want to copy the same behaviors to look like the elite, and they also draw us to consume in different ways. There are other forms of constraints that act on our nutritional behavior. This is a plot across 40 years showing the movement of supermarkets in the City of London in Canada, showing that between 1960 and 2000, there was an exodus of supermarkets from the city centre area, which reduced access to fresh fruits and vegetables. If we go beyond individual countries, we can also say that the producer-scrounger game is occurring at an international level. These are photos from Nepal where we can see adverts for soft drinks. Now, what's very important about these adverts is that the women in them are not traditional Nepalese women. They are an ideal of a woman that the company is trying to create in order to create a new kind of consumer. And it's not the case that nutrition follows economic development. Nutrition is used to open up economic development in other countries, and other aspects of economic development follow. So we can still see, if you like, the same relations going on at an international level, and you can also use the producer-scrounger game to look at gender equality, but I don't have time to do that today. Finally, I just wanted to return to the issue of ethnic groups and the idea of whether the metabolic differences that we see are inevitably genetic. There was a very interesting scenario that occurred in India. They had a rat study of nutrition, but they ran out of funding, and so the rats were left on a very poor diet for 50 generations. When they finally got back to this, they realized that not only should they do something about it, but they had a natural experiment of long-term exposure to an impoverished diet. So they started refeeding the rats. And what they found is that even after 2 generations of better quality nutrition, they saw many metabolic differences persisting, in particular higher levels of adiposity and insulin resistance. So what we can see there at this stage in an animal study, and we always need to be careful about extrapolating from animal studies to humans, but here's an example, at least from mammalian physiology, showing that long-term exposure to a poor quality diet can have intergenerational transmission on many traits relevant to chronic disease risk that don't appear to come from genotype itself. We could make more complex models of social hierarchy because ultimately what we want to explain is social gradients in health. And obviously the producer-scrounger model is deliberately very simplistic. It's a mathematical model. But we could make a model like this where in the middle of a hierarchy someone might be a producer for those above them in the hierarchy and a scrounger for those below them. So I hope what I've done in this presentation is shown you both that we can benefit from a multidisciplinary approach, but also given you some idea of how we can start to actually apply it and use data from all the three different sources. And I hope I've convinced you that it is realistic to argue that chronic diseases do have a societal basis. I like the producer scrounger game, simple as it is, because it's a dynamic model, and it suggests that we could play around with the idea of renegotiating that game and coming up with a more equal distribution of health. It also tells us that it's a multi-generational process by which we will have to engage with that. But finally, why is this all about nutrition? Well, I think nutrition's an incredibly exciting area because it just matters in so many different contexts. Nutrition is simultaneously in the body, the physiological medium whereby the disease develops and emerges. So it's fundamental if we look at the physiology. But if we look at human societies, nutrition is the arena in which social hierarchies emerge. I would say nutrition is the most important form of power in the world today. Nutrition is at many levels a means to discipline behavior. Even if the disciplining is very subtle, it still influences how we behave. But also, nutrition is a means to conceal our loss of agency because we're surrounded by endless choice in the nutritional products that are available to us. There's lots of different things. It doesn't mean they're always the healthy things. But because we see this endless choice, we're encouraged to think that we live in an environment of agency. And that allows us to forget that we're actually often being disempowered directly through the medium of nutrition. Thank you very much for listening.
That's a wonderful talk, thoroughly enjoyable and thoroughly informative as well. I'm going to put a little bit of a chink in some of what you're saying. Oh, thank you. I want to put first of all, a compliment to Jonathan, one of the most wonderful talks I think I've heard in quite a long time. And but I want to put a little bit of a chink in some of this because I think I think we know now that birth weight and the linear relationship that you're seeing doesn't happen for all chronic disease. So high birth weight are at risk for pediatric acute lymphoblastic leukemia and for breast cancer. So if you turn the dial on the non-communicable diseases and go towards the cancers, there's a bit of a chink in this. And I think it's important to identify it because what we do need to look at is a nonlinear relationship between birth weight and non-communicable disease, where we're actually exploring the extremes to understand the underlying physiology that's happening in pregnancy. But I also want to say that the maternal environment is important, but so is the paternal contribution. And so some of our research has actually looked at the inheritance of from the father of the ability, if the father has in utero been exposed to preeclampsia and the risk of preeclampsia in the offspring through the mother. Yeah. So there is some heritability there, so the father really has to have some role in this. And so I think we really do also need to think about infancy as very important critical windows within it, and not as a 0 to 12 phenomenon, but your overall gestalt of the evolution, physiology, and societal contributions was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I agree with all of those comments. And in fact, I always get told that the relationship isn't linear. The problem is that the examples I have, one doesn't see the uptick. I fully agree that microsomic babies, who I think probably just weren't really represented in those particular cohorts, you do start to see penalties being paid. And also it's interesting, it's a small study, but in the association of birth weight and nephron number, it seems to start to tail off. You get heavier, but you don't build more nephrons. I also fully agree with the data on the father. It gets quite complicated, but yes, I mean, fathers are introducing epigenetic effects, and that's a really rich area to explore as well. And then your third point was?
The third point was the role of the family through the child through
the different critical windows.
Looking at the rate of growth in infancy has influences.
Yeah.
Certain critical windows that some of us have written
Absolutely. I mean, I would fully agree. And infancy is a particularly interesting period because it seems to be a period during which you're still able to accumulate many aspects of metabolic capacity, but you're also able to start accumulating metabolic load. And in fact, you could say that the macrosomic fetus already picked up load in fetal life. One of the really interesting issues is that in the West, we are now tending to worry about high rates of infant weight gain, and it seems to be a risk factor for obesity. But in low and middle income countries, what we're still seeing is that those who gain weight fastest in infancy tend to have more lean mass in later life. So there's an interesting issue there about why we're seeing those population differences. We don't really understand. So I think infancy is particularly rewarding to look at. Don't be shy, you can't have believed everything. I really appreciate critical feedback. When you develop conceptual models, you can't get it all right, and people's comments are really, really valuable, and I appreciate them. So I'd be very happy to hear things where people think, I don't think I agree with that.
I'll throw one out. I think it's, I'm Ellen Grunbaum from anthropology, and I particularly appreciate the ways in which I think when we try to look at issues of nutrition, we often bring in things that are related to this social hierarchy and what's been done to create and influence the type of food supplies and the type of products and the marketing of products that you described. So I really appreciate that, and also the contrast with intentionally egalitarian societies, and they are working to maintain that mutuality. And then a question might come up, why is that so derailed in contemporary life? Or do we see some of it happening in some places and times? Or do you have any examples or insights into ways in which people have appreciated the kind of things you pointed out and are trying to work with them to create a different sort of environment for nutrition?
I can be confident I haven't influenced anyone yet, but if you wanted an example of a producer-scrounger society, which I think is doing very, very well, then most people would point to Sweden. And it's through taxation. So you can also think of the state as a scrounger, but it's a scrounger that the population has actually voluntarily contributed to. Because if the scrounger is less extreme, the scrounging also provides an insurance net when times get tough. So this is one of the issues I discussed in the book, that when you look at many peasant revolutions worldwide, they don't always want to destroy the social order altogether. What they want is to have a morality return to the social relations. Because if you are a tenant farmer, then you pay your harvest year on year. But when the year gets really tough, maybe the landlord helps you out with a return from the food stores. So producing and scrounging doesn't have to mean that any inequality is actually just wrong or it's a bit like a bank account. The question is, what is the right social relations to have in any given scenario? And some people providing an insurance network could actually generally be the best solution. And I think you see in a state like Sweden egalitarian levels of health that most other countries can't reach. And that is through a sort of voluntary, well, not sure voluntary, but an organized system of scrounging. People pay very high taxation, but they get back a lot as a safety net at many different levels of society, and it goes straight towards health.
And we can see that in a lot of other, societies in Africa, for example, where there was a seasonal tribute to the sheikh and a redistribution at the festivals, or looking out for those in need. So those kind of things really are well established, and,
Yeah.
and they must have some. It would be very interesting to look at the nutritional and health implications of societies that have functioned like that.
Yeah. I think what's nice about the producer-scrounger game is that you can apply it to many different social models. If you're an anthropologist, you can look at pastoralism, you can look at horticultural cultivation, so on. You can look at intensive agriculture. You can also look at industrial society. So it's a framework that isn't derived from a particular historical period, which usually means you pick up a bit of baggage about the terminology that you use. If you have one theoretical framework that you can apply to seagulls and humans, obviously it's broad, and you've lost something, but you've also gained something from the sort of, it's slightly more neutral, I think. And I actually contacted Richard Sibley to ask him, when he invented the game with Barnard, were they thinking, because universities were often quite Marxist at that time, were they approaching it from that perspective? And they said not at all. They just wanted to model bird behavior. So I think that's quite an interesting perspective.
But they would have talked about a surplus and the size of the surplus, and the scrounging depends upon how large the surplus is, and of course who owns it.
Yes. No, I agree. I don't think they could have avoided being influenced at some level by other departments' academic work at that time. But they certainly weren't sort of overtly thinking of a Marxist approach at that time. So I think that makes it quite an interesting model.
We have time for one more question, by the way.
Hi, thank you also for an incredibly stimulating talk. I'm Elliot Friedman from Human Development Family Studies. You just alluded to a moral dimension to peasant revolts, and I'm wondering if you see these gradients in health as a function of this producer-scrounger relationship. To speculate, if you will, or if there are data to support, how much of that might be a sort of psychosocial unfairness, morality kind of dimension versus differences in resource access?
I think in my own work, because I measure body composition, and that's literally somatic resources, my own approach has been to focus on unequal access to resources. But as soon as you actually look at how human societies operate, much of it comes from the way that we construct our world. So it has to be both. I hope it's a rich framework within which people can adopt many different approaches and focus on different things. So you can't look at social inequality without understanding how ideologically we generate constructs of hierarchy. And that it plays a key role in policing the hierarchy, but so does nutrition. So it's got both elements.